The federal courtroom descended into stunned silence as Judge Amy Berman Jackson slammed down her gavel with an unfamiliar force. "Arve!" The report echoed off the wood-paneled room like the report of a gunshot and startled even the old hands at the court reporters' stations. "Mrs. Bondi, you are in contempt of court," Judge Jackson announced, her voice cutting with authority. "I am directing the U.S. Marshals to take you into custody immediately." Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi stood quietly at the defense table, blonde hair surrounding a face that showed no fear, despite the jaw-dropping words of the judge. As two U.S. Marshals made their way, moving slowly towards the successful attorney, Bondi put up her hand slightly. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice firm in the midst of the chaos surrounding her, "before you render a judgment you might regret, I think you should look over these papers." Bondi's aide hurried forward and dumped a sealed folder on the judge's bench. The crowd watched rapt silence as Judge Jackson, infamous for her stern decrees against public figures, glared at Bondi before hesitantly extending a hand for the folder. What transpired over the next 10 minutes would not just overturn the judge's ruling, but shock the whole judicial system. Nobody in that courtroom could have anticipated how swiftly the authority would change hands, or what Pam Bondi had uncovered that would cause even the powerful Judge Amy Berman Jackson to withdraw. Before we tell you what was in those papers, be sure to subscribe and like our channel for more explosive courtroom battles that alter the trajectory of American justice. Judge Amy Berman Jackson had made a name for herself as unyielding. At 69, the Obama appointee to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia had overseen some of the most contentious political litigation of the last 10 years. Her strict demeanor and refusal to allow any disruption in her court had earned her respect and criticism. Legal commentators usually referred to her as fastidious and by the book, whereas her detractors accused her of being agenda-driven and excessively severe. Today's hearing had already been strained from the moment it started. The case was one of allegations of prosecutorial abuse in a high-profile political probe, and Pam Bondi was defending a defendant who accused the Department of Justice of withholding evidence intentionally. Bondi, 58, was accustomed to being at the center of high-stakes courtroom fights. As Florida's first female attorney general, she had battled everything from health care bills to drug smuggling. Having served her time as governor, she had developed a reputation as a tenacious defense lawyer who handled cases of government overreach. A master planner with a keen strategic mind, Bondi never entered a courtroom without an exit strategy. The courtroom was filled with reporters, legal monitors, and members of the public, all feeling that this hearing would turn into something newsworthy. What they hadn't expected was how dramatic it would turn out to be. The confrontation had reached a boiling point when Bondi had challenged the honesty of the handling of prosecution evidence. Judge Jackson had cautioned her twice regarding the tone and accusation, yet Bondi continued, implying that some documents had been deliberately withheld from the defense. "Miss Bondi, these are serious allegations you're making against the prosecution," Judge Jackson had said, voice laced with irritation. "Until you have actual proof for these allegations, I will not permit you to continue arguing this way." Bondi had replied calmly, "Your Honor, we have good reason to believe that evidence of exoneration was intentionally withheld from discovery. If the court please, let me show you our evidence. You've made these accusations numerous times, Miss Bondi," Judge Jackson cut in, "but yet you've produced nothing concrete to substantiate. This is not a stage for political theater or baseless accusations against the Department of Justice." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Bondi responded, her tone steadfast, "this is not political theater. This is about justice and due process for my client." Judge Jackson's patience had visibly worn thin. "Miss Bondi, I've heard enough. Your observations are on the verge of contempt, Your Honor. If the pursuit of truth is contempt, then maybe contempt has a lesser standard than we might think," Bondi had replied, prompting gasps in the courtroom. It was this last remark that had gotten Judge Jackson so worked up, prompting her to issue her ruling of contempt and her order to jail Bondi immediately. Now that the judge opened the cryptic folder Bondi had given her, the stakes could not have been greater. Should Bondi have been bluffing, her reputation and career would be irreparably damaged. Should Judge Jackson toss out valid evidence, it may destroy the whole case, and even her place on the bench. The whole courtroom was holding its breath as Judge Jackson started reading the material, her face evolving from scornful to worried with every moment. Judge Jackson's eyes grew a shade wider as she took the first document from the folder. She looked up at Bondi, who still stood beside the U.S. Marshals, her body relaxed even under threat of imminent detention. "Where did you get these documents, Miss Bondi?" Judge Jackson asked, her voice softer than previous. "They were given to us by a whistleblower in the DOJ last evening, Your Honor," Bondi responded. "You will see from the authentication markers and electronic timestamps that they are original internal communication." The top prosecutor, James Harrington, stood up abruptly from his chair. "Your Honor, we do not know anything of these so-called documents. The prosecution requests a chance to examine whatever Miss Bondi is bringing before the court continues." Judge Jackson raised her hand to stop him. "You'll get your turn, Mr. Harrington. I'm taking a look at these materials myself, for the time being." The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Jackson read on, every so often jotting down something on a notepad. The prosecutors murmured with an air of urgency among themselves as Bondi's client, a former government employee accused of obstruction of justice, remained stone still, his gaze locked on the judge. After a few minutes, Judge Jackson turned to the court reporter. "Let the record reflect that I am reading documents presented by defense counsel appearing to be internal Department of Justice memoranda and emails regarding evidence in this case." Harrington stood up once again. "Your Honor, not knowing where these supposed documents came from, the prosecution objects to their consideration. They could be forged or illegally obtained." Judge Jackson shot back at Mr. Harrington. "These reports contain official DOJ watermarks and were seemingly sent through the department's internal secure messaging system. Are you implying that Miss Bondi or her staff created Department of Justice watermark document?" "No, Your Honor, but then please sit down while I get on with the examination." The court became silent once more as Judge Jackson moved on to the next batch of documents. Her demeanor became visibly darker. "Mr. Harrington," she stated after a few tense moments, "these emails seem to indicate members of your prosecution team talking about the intentional withholding of some witness statements from discovery. Can you tell us about this?" Harrington paused. "Your Honor, not knowing the specific emails, I can't make any comment about their content or context." "Let me read one to you then," Judge Jackson said, her voice now controlled but cold. "Hammond's testimony is contrary to our timeline. If we add it to discovery, the defense will get us off on the grounds that our whole case is tainted. Suggest we label it as non-relevant to discovery need. This message is 3 months old and copied to your department email address, Mr. Harrington." Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Bondi said nothing, allowing evidence to be its own best advocate. Harrington stood up again, looking flushed. "Your Honor, if there is such an email, it was obviously talking about a legal ruling on relevance, not intimating impermissible withholding of evidence. Is that correct?" Judge Jackson responded. "And how do you account for the response copied to you also?" "Agreed. Make Hammond's affidavit a separate filing from the rest of the evidence. Market it as internal work product in order to protect it from discovery obligations." "Mr. Harrington, do you know Brady v. "Of course, Your Honor," Harrington answered brusquely. "Then you know that the prosecution has a legal duty to disclose evidence that could exonerate the defendant. Those emails indicate a planned approach to get around that duty." The two American marshals who had come to Bondi previously now stood uncomfortably unsure of whether they should go ahead and try to issue a contempt order in light of the developing disclosure. The developing disclosure. Judge Jackson turned to the second document, and her face altered once more, this time to something near shock. She gazed straight at Harrington. "This report seems to be a sworn affidavit from Thomas Hammond, one of the important witnesses in this case, totally opposing the timeline introduced in your opening statement. Under your own filing system number identifiable on this document, it was in your hands 6 months ago, but it shows up nowhere in discovery materials we have received and are producing to the defense." Harrington opened his mouth to answer, but Judge Jackson had more to say. "More worrisome, Mr. Harrington, is this email from you yourself ordering your staff to, and I quote, remind Hammond of the necessity of keeping our set timeline consistent prior to his testimony. Would you like to tell me what you were trying to say with that?" The courtroom was filled with stunned murmurs. One of the junior prosecutors at Harrington's table buried his face in his hand. Bondi finally broke her silence. Your Honor, there are 17 additional instances of suppressed exculpatory evidence detailed in the rest of the document. Considering what we've learned, we seek immediate dismissal of all charges against my client and a formal investigation into prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Jackson put the documents aside and glared at the U.S. Marshals who remained standing around Bondi. Gentlemen, you can go back to your post. The contempt order is revoked. The escalation had reached its climax. What had started as Bondi being sent to jail for contempt had turned into serious charges against the prosecution team itself. And Judge Jackson, who was herself known for her by-the-book style, now had to make a deciding choice that not only would influence this case, but also her own place in history on the bench. Judge Amy Berman Jackson pushed her reading glasses down her nose and placed them gently on the bench. The courtroom fell completely silent, all eyes on her, as she aligned the papers in Bondi's file and shut it firmly. The court will recess for 30 minutes, she declared. Mr. Harrington, I order you and your whole team to stay in the building. Miss Bondi, you and your client will stay too. Court is in recess. The gavel came down again, and Judge Jackson stood quickly, moving out through the doorway behind the bench. The moment she was out of sight, the courtroom exploded in a hum of hasty words and sudden motion. Reporters scrambled out to submit first reports on the sudden turn of events. Exactly 30 minutes later, Judge Jackson emerged in the courtroom, which had filled up again immediately with more spectators pushing against the back wall. The atmosphere was charged when she sat down and scanned the room with a somber look. Before I speak to the serious issues before us, she started, I wish to make something very clear. This court's first duty to justice and the rule of law, not to any political agenda, not to any person, and certainly not to defending the reputation of any institution, including this court. She fixed Bondi with a stern look. Miss Bondi, I must apologize. My order of contempt was made without due consideration of your allegation. Attorneys as officers of the court have not only the right, but the responsibility to zealously represent their clients, particularly when there is a question of procedural fairness. Murmurs of shock spread through the courtroom. Public apologies were not something Judge Jackson was known for. She went on, but the way that you came into court with accusations without giving notice to the court of this evidence created an unnecessarily adversarial. In the future, I would anticipate such grave accusations being brought through proper channels, Bondi said with, Understood, Your Honor. The timing of our receipt of the document imposed usual circumstance. Judge Jackson turned her attention next to the prosecution table where Harrington stood ashen-faced beside his group. Mr. Harrington, the documents submitted by the defense include very disturbing evidence of what appears to be intentional prosecutorial misconduct. The concealment of exculpatory evidence is one of the most grave violations of prosecutorial responsibility. Harrington rose slowly. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, Mr. Harrington. Not yet. Judge Jackson's voice was steel. I have studied these documents in detail during the recess and spoken with the Chief Judge. On the evidence before me, I am doing the following immediately. She brandished a document she had drafted at recess. First, all charges against the defendant are dismissed with prejudice. The defendant's eyes briefly shut in relief, as Bondi's professional decorum did not waver despite the substantive win. Second, I am referring this case to the Office of Professional Responsibility within the Department of Justice for a complete inquiry into the behavior of the prosecution team. Harrington's shoulders visibly slumped. Third, I am directing an independent review of all the cases prosecuted by this team during the last 5 years to see if this type of misconduct has happened in other cases. One of the younger prosecutors audibly gasped. And lastly, Judge Jackson went on, her voice now even and controlled. I am voluntarily reporting to the Judicial Conduct Committee my disposition of this case, including my initial rejection of the Yo defense's objections in the contempt order against Miss Bondi. The last of the remarks sent a shock wave through the courtroom. Even Bondi was taken aback. Your Honor, she rose from her seat. Although we welcome the court's second thought, self-reporting is not needed. You made a correction as soon as you were given evidence. Judge Jackson shook her head. Miss Bondi, our judicial system's integrity relies on accountability in all ranks. If I require it from prosecutors, then I must show it myself. She spoke in front of the whole courtroom. What we have seen here today is at once a failure and a correction of our system of justice. The failure is that of the apparent misconduct, which almost led to an unjust prosecution. The correction is brought about by the hard work of defense counsel and the system's ability, although sometimes tardy, to right its own wrong. Back to Bondi, Judge Jackson added, "Miss Bondi, the court recognizes that but for your persistence and the evidence you acquired, there would be a very grave miscarriage of justice today. Although I do not approve of the aggressive tactic, I cannot argue with the result." Bondi nodded once more. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense wants to thank the court for its reconsideration and firm action." In one last surprising gesture, Judge Jackson spoke to the U.S. Marshal, who had almost arrested Bondi earlier. "Gentlemen, thank you for your restraint and professionalism today. It is a reminder that even when following orders, sound judgment must still be exercised." With that, Judge Jackson dropped her gavel one last time. "This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned." While spectators and reporters poured out of the courtroom to herald the stunning about-face, Pam Bondi quietly gathered her papers. She had gone into the courtroom with the possibility of being detained and emerged, having uncovered egregious misbehavior, won her client's release, and won the admiration of one of the country's most gruff judges. It was a win not only for her client, but for the ideals of due process, and for seeking truth, principles that Bondi had put her liberty on the line to uphold. By evening, Courthouse Theater had burst onto all major news networks and websites. Video segments of Judge Jackson rescinding her contempt order and dismissing the case went viral, with Darren Bondi's Jackson and Just Restored trending across the country. TV legal experts on panel shows analyzed detail of the historic hearing. On one of the big networks, a one-time federal prosecutor described the meaning. "What we saw today was unusual on a number of levels. Judge Jackson has a reputation for keeping a tight lid on her courtroom and not backing down from anyone. For her to reverse a contempt finding, not just, but throw the whole case out and refer the prosecution for investigation, that indicates the gravity of what Bondi found." The political shockwaves were just as profound. The case had been perceived by many as politically inspired from the very beginning, and Bondi's victory added to fears of weaponization of the justice system. Conservative pundits complimented Bondi's backbone, and even liberal legal thinkers accepted the value in unmasking procedural abuse regardless of political leaning. "The system functioned today," said a leading civil liberties lawyer on a cable news show, "not at first, but in the end. And that is the main point. Justice requires vigilance, and often we saw with Pam Bondi considerable personal risk." Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice announced the immediate reassignment of James Harrington and the formation of a special team to examine the allegations of misconduct. The Attorney General issued a statement. "The integrity of our justice system depends on prosecutors fulfilling their ethical and legal obligation. Any intentional withholding of exculpatory evidence is unacceptable deviation from DOJ value. We take these charges seriously." For Pam Bondi, the aftermath was both professionally bittersweet and personally reflective. In her initial interview after the courtroom battle, she was measured in her tone. "It wasn't about me or Judge Jackson. It was about making sure that our system of justice works as it should. When prosecutors suppress evidence, they're not merely violating rules, they're violating the fundamental trust on which our entire legal system is founded." When questioned about risking jail time for contempt, Bondi responded, "There are points in your career where you must make a decision regarding what is most important to you, personal comfort or professional integrity. I knew the risk I was taking, but I also knew what was contained in those documents." The anonymous whistleblower, who had given the critical documents to Bondi, ensured his impact. More information emerged, with the implication that the evidence tampering in this instance may not have been an isolated event. 3 other cases, also prosecuted by the same team, came under scrutiny, and within weeks, serious doubts were being raised about the conduct of those cases as well. Judge Amy Berman Jackson, as she said she would, filed a self-report with the Judicial Conduct Committee. In a public statement, which is not common, she responded to her action. "Judges are human, and human errors' integrity isn't never making errors, but how we react when those errors become evident. The judiciary needs to hold itself accountable to the same measures that it enforces on others. The reaction of the legal community to Judge Jackson's self-reporting was resoundingly positive. One judicial ethics specialist said, "Judge Jackson's willingness to own up to her mistake and put herself on review shows precisely the type of judicial accountability our system requires. It's really enhanced her reputation instead of hurting it." 6 weeks after the sensational hearing, an official review found that Judge Jackson had done the right thing in correcting her initial mistake and advised against disciplining her. The review particularly mentioned her dedication to transparency and accountability as a model of judicial behavior. The defendant, by now completely exonerated, sued the Department of Justice for civil rights violation in a deliberate misconduct discovered in Bondi's evidence. Legal specialists anticipated an eventual settlement instead of a long drawn-out court battle that would further reveal the department's shortcomings. Perhaps the greatest long-term effect was in the form of judicial reform. The case spurred renewed debate regarding supervision of prosecutorial behavior and the difficulty defense lawyers encounter with misconduct suspected, but hard to establish. Numerous members of Congress referenced the case when introducing bills to enhance Brady disclosure requirements and institute stronger remedies for violation. Law schools around the nation added the case to their curriculum on legal ethics, with one professor commenting, "The Bondi-Jackson confrontation is a perfect example of how fragile and our justice system is. It's a strong reminder to would-be lawyers that ethical courage often involves personal risk." For plain Americans viewing the drama, the case provided a rare glimpse behind the scenes of the workings of justice, both in failing and in recovering. Public opinion polls several months later revealed greater understanding of prosecutorial disclosure requirements and greater concern about potential power of the justice. A year after the courtroom showdown, Pam Bondi and Judge Amy Berman Jackson shared a podium at a judicial conference panel, "Adversaries in Court, Allies for Justice." Their shared presence was a testament to how two strong-willed legal experts, much as they had clashed dramatically in court, deep down were committed to core values. What transpired in that courtroom was uncomfortable for all concerned, Judge Jackson admitted but the result, revealing wrongdoing, avoiding a wrongful conviction, and initiating systemic examination, did justice in the best possible way, Bondi agreed. The adversarial system succeeds not in spite of our conflicts but at times because of when each does its part with integrity. Defense lawyers vigorously argue, judges impartially deciding, and all parties devoted to truth, justice results, even if the journey there is sometimes melodramatic. The Judge Amy Berman Jackson Pam Bondi case would be remembered not only for its theater of the courtroom, but for showing that in America's justice, even the most powerful be held accountable when evidence and truth are allowed to rule. Thanks for watching this amazing tale of justice served. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories of courtroom intrigue and the continued battle for truth in our justice. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you had Pam Bondi's shoes? We'll catch you next video.